I'm Dorothy Roberts at the law school here in Africana Studies and Sociology. And I will be moderating this panel on Jamaica. Our speakers are Deborah Thomas, who is here on the stage now, who is on the faculty here in Anthropology and Africana Studies, and she's also the director of the Center for Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. And we will be joined shortly by Horace Levy, who is the Deputy Chair of the Board of Peace Management Initiative and also the Executive Director of Jamaicans for Justice. So Deb, if you want to begin.
Okay, it's now working. Thank you, Michael, for organizing this and all of the other panelists. It's been a really, I think, exciting and inspiring conversation to sort of think through the synergies between the different contexts that we're all talking about. I am going to, a lot of people have laid out some of the issues related to political economy, and I'm going to take us in a somewhat different direction and talk a little bit about the psychic legacies of slavery, colonialism, and violence, and how we see those bearing down on people's lives today. I'm going to show you a few things also, but I'll tell you about that when we get closer. Okay. In his essay, The Fact of Blackness, Stuart Hall reminded us that attention to the political and economic dimensions of inequality could only ever tell, at best, half the story of racism. Building on his earlier work, attending to ideology and articulation, he was interested in reconceptualizing the Marxist concept of determination through an understanding that there is no necessary correspondence between political economy and the realm of ideas or knowledge. With this opening, questions of political life suddenly required a more humanist, and I might even say anthropological, approach, as the articulations among the institutions of the state and civil society, the movement of markets, and the production and reproduction of ideological hegemonies became empirical questions in a dynamic field of struggle. So today, I want to get us to what Hall would have called the inner landscape and the unconscious mechanisms of racism via his classic 1985 discussion of Althusser's approach to ideology, in order to arrive at a material semiotic view of racial process that, while emergent from colonialism and New World modernity, is also reproduced, changed, and enacted at the micro level in the everyday. So I want to keep in mind his important question, what is ideology, but precisely this work of fixing meaning through establishing a chain of equivalences, right? And I want to do this because it helps us to ask our own questions. How do racial meanings circulate in and through changing material conditions and social relations? And to what extent are we both complicit in these processes and simultaneously able to transform them? So over the past 5 years, I've been working collaboratively on a multimedia project addressing the 2010 state of emergency in Kingston, Jamaica. During what's been called the Tivoli incursion, Jamaican security forces entered Tivoli Gardens to capture Christopher Dudus Coke, who was, had an extradition order had been served by the United States Department of Justice to remove him and so that he could stand trial in the US for gun and drug running. When the security forces entered Tivoli Gardens, which was the neighborhood of which he was the leader, strongman leader, they killed 74 civilians, at least. Officially, they killed 74 civilians, and community members would say the number's more like 200. So since 2012, we've been recording narratives with West Kingston community members in order to provide a public platform through which they can talk about what they experienced during that week and also name and memorialize loved ones that they lost, because there had not been a list of the dead released either. So our film, 4 Days in May, as well as the installation that will be mounted at the Penn Museum next month, juxtaposes these recorded narratives with additional visual and textual materials to place the diverse archives of state violence in dialogue with each other. By doing so, our intention is to evoke the entanglements these forms of violence reflect and produce, and to identify the forms of community, subjectivity, and expectation that are produced by violence. But today, I want to draw on the narrative of Sean Bowen, one of the youth we recorded, in order to begin to ask the following questions. What work does racism accomplish in specific historical conditions? What are the unconscious mechanisms through which this work is accomplished? And in what ways do these psychic landscapes of racial modernity inform approaches to garrison Jamaica? But before I get to Sean, let me say a little bit about political life in the wake of the plantation in Jamaica. So what is a garrison? In Jamaica, as elsewhere in the British West Indies, the reckoning of land rights, norms regarding the organization of political authority, and conflicts among subgroups developed not in relation to notions of indigeneity, but vis-a-vis plantation slavery. So just as the plantation was foundational to modern production and labor organization, it was this phenomenon that also shaped post-colonial political infrastructures, practices, and processes, including the forms of patronage and clientelistic loyalty that developed in the post-independence period. In Jamaica, the political economy of modern citizenship was, by the mid-20th century, defined through participation in the trade union movement. This broad movement ultimately became politicized via the formation of oppositional political parties, each connected to a union. From the earliest moments, conflicts between unions were also conflicts regarding the politicization of territory, especially in downtown Kingston, and these conflicts were typically violent. Allegiances to union leaders, and therefore to political parties, were generally understood to be transmitted through the family, the community, and the workplace. And power in this context was personalized, ultimately grounded within the charisma and patronage of one or another leader. Clientelistic networks were not limited to those operating within the domains of organized political party activism, but instead also included those within the fields of education, business, journalism, and community development who could trade information, skills, and contacts with their counterparts in politics. Continued loyalty was the result of continued patronage, and this laid the groundwork for the system's more explicit manifestation through the construction of housing schemes that were informally made available to people on the basis of party membership. So contemporary garrisons, of which Tivoli Gardens is considered the most perfect example, thus became territorially rooted homogeneous voting communities where political support is exchanged for contracts and other social welfare benefits. These exchanges have been central to general procedures for the distribution of paid work among constituencies downtown. And typically, the vote benefits nexus has been mediated through the relationship between a politician, usually the member of parliament for a constituency, and a local don. And so this is Dulles in Tivoli Gardens prior to 2010, May. This relationship between the politician and the don has not been a static one. It became part of a more general ideological struggle during the 1970s, and it has subsequently transformed as the elaboration of the transnational trades in cocaine and weapons supplanted a previously smaller scale trafficking in ganja. So this has strengthened the role of the dons vis-a-vis the politicians, and it's what also brought garrison dons to the attention of the US government. It's what has perpetuated a kind of permanent war. So anyone familiar with garrison politics in Jamaica would know that 2010 was not the first time the military and police entered or attempted to enter Tivoli Gardens by force. In May 1997, a joint battalion fought community gunmen for 3 days before retreating. 4 persons were killed, including a 6-year-old boy who had been jumping on a bed, and the security forces were forced to retreat. And in July 2001, security forces attempted again to enter the community to recover guns and drugs. This time the death toll was 27, including a policeman and a soldier. In both cases, no one was found criminally responsible for the deaths. Residents of Tivoli Gardens thus experienced the recurrence of war between representatives of the state and supporters of the Dawn as part of the normal fabric of existence in contemporary Jamaica. And that, in fact, is the word they use when they talk about what happened when the security forces came in 2010. Well, it wasn't like normal. It was different from how it normally is, right? So they have a normal expectation of violence in their community. While violence here has a constancy about it, it also shifts in relation to the specific entanglements that might characterize eventful moments in its duration. Where once violence would have been produced mainly through the channels of political partisanship that pitted the People's National Party supporters against those of the Jamaica Labour Party, after the 1980s crack boom, it took on another set of turfs that, while still politically partisan, were also strongly economic, which meant that loyalties could shift and power struggles both multiplied and fragmented. The normal, therefore, must be understood as community members' awareness of the ordinary and shifting ways violence has been organized at many scales, within the garrison, between the garrison and the state, between the garrison and the transnational processes within which it's embedded and from which it profits, and between the state and the multilateral institutions to which it is held accountable. What were thus made legible by the Tivoli incursion in 2010, then, were the various scales at which and through which the garrison operates. In other words, what I'm trying to say is the garrison doesn't merely denote a physical space, right, and one that's simultaneously local, national, and global, but also evokes a kind of affective disposition encompassing the requirement of submission to a set of dictating norms and forms of violence that include the suspension of critical consciousness, the simultaneous denigration of Blackness and its celebration in popular culture, the violent policing of movement from both the Dawn and the politician, and the need to appeal to a quote-unquote leader for the provision of basic requirements. In other words, not organizing to get them on your own. This is why other modalities of organizing political life and social development, like Rastafari, or like the People's Freedom Movement, or the Black Power movement, are seen and subdued as threats, not only to Jamaican sovereignty and US hegemony, but also to the worldview that positions Black bodies as instruments of profit, both economic and political, for others. The normative expectation of violence, then, has to do with the priorness of transnational Black subordination throughout the Americas, with the foundationality of Blackness as a technology of ontological abjection, undergirding modern notions of humanity, economy, and politics, as this is experienced in dynamic ways over time. All right, Sean. Sean came to us by accident, as it were. We were at a friend of mine's studio, Grafton Studios, and one of the musicians called his nephew to tell him that we were recording people talking about what happened to them during the incursion, and said that he should come and tell us his story. So he arrived within an hour, and we put him in front of the camera. Sean talked about being ordered out of his house, taken to clear roadblocks. He recalled being moved from building to building with other men, all of their hands tied behind their backs. He remembered spending the night in a leaky bathroom with some of the men groaning in pain, others weak without necessary medication, and then being taken to another building where they were made to line up on their knees in 2 rows in the courtyard while soldiers taunted them with machine guns. He remembered being relieved when they were returned to the truck, though it was not immediately clear that they were being taken to the National Stadium, where they were processed and ultimately released. So there are 2 moments in Sean's narrative that I would like to discuss here. The first has to do with the soldier, one of the soldiers who was picking on him because at that time he was using a bleaching cream. So he said, I had a little skin tone, being brown. And the soldier told him he didn't like how he looked, said he should kill him for looking that way. It's true that many have interpreted skin bleaching as a sign of racial self-hatred, and this position is often most heatedly expressed by Black middle-class Jamaicans. Nevertheless, some critical scholars have also read bleaching as a form of satirical performance and play that has emerged at the grassroots level through popular culture. For example, Krista Thompson has theorized vernacular photography, and in this case, that would be the ubiquitous video camera at the dance hall. So vernacular photography for her is a way for people to, in her words, recast their relationship to the modern. She argues that bleaching makes people representable in Black public spheres across diasporic locations through a visual technology whose color balance was originally calibrated in relation to whiteness and therefore not sufficiently sensitive to accurately recognize the subtleties of darker skin tones. While bleaching, and therefore popular practices related to Blackness and skin color, has been a subject of heated debate, it seems remarkable that race and color have not ordinarily been recognized as important factors in analyses of the structural configuration of the garrison, despite their centrality to culture and political struggles since the 19th century. Instead, racial reckoning has usually been invoked in relation to the common popular ideology, and clearly we've talked about this in relation to Brazil and elsewhere, the common ideology that class is the primary structuring principle within Jamaican society, not race. Anthropologist Jack Alexander, for example, long ago reported that middle-class Jamaicans reckoned their genealogies in relation to a common origin story featuring a non-legal union between a white male master and a Black female slave that produced illegitimate brown offspring who held a middling status between master and slave and who therefore also represented a kind of indigeneity, being neither fully British nor fully African. Alexander argued that in the inaugural moment of this story, class, status, and race were directly correlated, but that the story achieved mythic status because it was seen to have operational value for the society as a whole, explaining not only the past, but also the present and future. This understanding of race and its relationship to the foundational narratives of Jamaican society, passed down from generation to generation and institutionalized through the educational system, housing, employment, politics, religion, and patterns of sociality, establishes the historical rootedness of society and its members' place in it. In this way, citizenship became expressed through Creole multiraciality, which was the dominant mid-20th century ideology of middle-class nationalists. While my own and others' research has shown that public definitions of cultural citizenship have, since the late 1990s, tended more towards centering Blackness over brownness, narratives like Sean's evoke the ways that these earlier reckonings of racial origin continue to structure the value placed on racial and cultural practices seen as connected to lower-class Black people. This is because race always prefigures modern notions of what it means to be human and potentially a citizen. It disciplines us into the hierarchies of value and personhood that attach to particular bodies. The second aspect of Sean's narrative that's relevant to my discussion here has to do with policemen taunting him and the other men who were rounded up. They said that since Pasa Pasa, which is a popular street dance that was held every Wednesday on the sort of main road bordering Tivoli Gardens, said Pasa Pasa wasn't going to be held that evening, this was a Wednesday, and therefore that the men would have to enact it for the police right there and then. So I'm just going to play you this little bit.
So right now we had to fall in with some clapping, because it's like a stage show we have to provide for these guys now. To the humiliation that we're under right now. We have to perform a stage show for them clapping, singing, falling in, or a DJ and all them things there.
Do you understand what he said? Right, he's saying that, you know, the police told them they had to perform Pasa Pasa, like they had to do it for them right there and then, right? Sing, dance, clap, rap, right? And the word he used, we've used many times over the last 2 days, like what are the common forms of humiliation that are durative, right, across time. Anyway, so when we heard this in the studio, I gasped because my mind went immediately to that canonical image of the slave ship during the Middle Passage. And then, of course, these ideas of slaves being brought up onto the deck to be exercised, right? So Sean's recollection prompted us to position the men tied to each other and moved from place to place under threat of the gun in an affective and material relationship with the slaves brought on deck during the Middle Passage to play music, dance, and be exercised, right? We saw the same forms of humiliation. We heard the same connotations regarding the value of their personhood. And we were therefore prompted to consciously position the garrison as a dynamic historical phenomenon through which violence has been organized in relation to these older racial logics, right? So if race is not an elective identity marker, that's Kristen Smith, but is a historical structure and relational experience grounded in local landscapes of power and aspiration, then our attention should be drawn to the ways it is felt, made, and made relevant through practice in the everyday. In other words, raciality is not merely produced through the visual apprehension of familiar differences, but is built interactively, intersubjectively, and dynamically in relation to other humans, landscapes, and objects. This is what Stuart Hall meant when he asserted, quote, "The principal theoretical reversal accomplished by no necessary correspondence is that determinacy is transferred from the genetic origins of class or other social forces in a structure to the effects or results of a practice." So it's through practice in this broad sense that raciality is imbued with affect, and this generates both the more exceptional and performative moments of racial violence and the subjectivities emerging from this violence. So here I think Ahmad Mtarek's important work on the materiality of race in practice is helpful to us. Mtarek draws from semiotics to argue that meaning derives from the study of signs, practices, and/or objects in relation to one another. Her primary interest lies in why a biological understanding of race keeps creeping into social constructionism, whereby race seems like a real and knowable object beyond the context of its making and apprehension, something that materializes in a person's body rather than an effect of relations between and among different bodies, including institutional bodies and those imagined as having demographic or other analytic salience. The challenge in studying race, as Mtarek puts it, is to denaturalize without dematerializing it, and to simultaneously attend to materiality without fixing race. What this requires of us is thoughtful attention to the history of how New World capitalist modernity has not only shaped the institutional and social arrangements that structure our societies, but also the psychic expectations we develop for our interactions with others. I've already discussed some ways we might interpret the insistence of police and soldiers that Sean and the other men sing and dance for them, but let me now return to the soldiers' reaction to Sean's bleaching. Before Tivoli, there was Bakawal, the slum, a place of political radicalism, the grounding of Rastafari, the home of rural migrants to Kingston who brought with them their emergent, syncretized religious practices. Bakawal was a space that for nationalists remained woefully and stubbornly ungovernable. For others, it was a scourge of insistently anti-modern Black illegibility. While it was the PNP government under Norman Manley that initiated plans to transform the slums of West Kingston, the change in government just before independence in 1962 meant that the Jamaica Labour Party would implement the waves of slum clearance that led to the creation of Tivoli Gardens under the leadership of then Minister of Development and Housing, Edward Siaga, a Jamaican of Lebanese descent who was born in the US and who, not incidentally, studied social anthropology at Harvard and did research into the very traditions and religious practices that people in West Kingston were developing as they migrated, both when he was doing research in the countryside and when he was creating the relationships in West Kingston that would then later lead to his political ascendancy. For those who cut their teeth on the Black nationalisms of the late 1960s Black Power movements, Mr. Siaga's bulldozing of Baka Wall and his construction of Tivoli Gardens would have represented an aborted process of racial consciousness. For these nationalists, Mr. Siaga created with Tivoli Gardens a self-hating Black population by transferring the reverence for British whiteness to Syrian whiteness. That's a local Jamaican racial category that basically means anybody of Middle Eastern descent. And thereby interrupting a process of Black social and political and spiritual liberation that was in process there and elsewhere in West Kingston at the time within Rastafari camps and through other groups committed to forms of critical Black consciousness. Representatives of the security forces, themselves members of an emergent Black middle class, might also have seen this continued colonially inspired reverence as an affront to their own class position and racial consciousness, and this could have fed into their approach to people in Tivoli Gardens, both garrison hardliners and bystanders, during the state of emergency in 2010. So I'm belaboring these points here in order to drive home the argument that the garrison is a racially saturated space of relationality among a range of differently situated actors, including the security forces, even in their absence. I'm also lingering here in order to disturb the notion that the making of the poor and the making of the Black are different processes. Sylvia Wynter reminds us, after all, that both these makings are really one and the same, the making of the human at the moment of New World contact through the recognition and over-representation of the European as man. And I'm tarrying here to draw us back to Stuart Hall's assertion that the traces of what he calls semantic zones, zones that are not merely material but also psychic, can remain, quote, long after the social relations to which they have referred have disappeared. They can be reactivated at a later stage, even when the discourses have fragmented as coherent or organic ideologies. While there's a continuity to the psychic dimensions of racial degradation in Jamaica and across the Western Hemisphere, I'm also arguing that we should see the Tivoli incursion as marking an end of a particular vision of revolutionary political possibility throughout the region. Political scientist Rupert Lewis has argued that the state of emergency and eventual extradition of Christopher Coke tells us something about the, quote, subjective dimensions of political life and the changing socio-racial constitution of political parties in Jamaica. If it's true that about 60% of urban constituencies are fully or partially garrisonized, then, Lewis argues, what happened in 2010 was really the first major assault on the system of garrison politics, an attempt to reclaim Tivoli Gardens within a national project and juridical system. While through the decades, the political and parallel garrison leadership has used the state to generate employment and housing within specific downtown constituencies, under this structuring of politics, the Jamaican people actually saw their material, social, personal, and human life freedoms eroded. For Lewis, the real post-colonial crisis rests upon the fact that both political parties in Jamaica have become little more than election machines and don't have a philosophical agenda other than gaining control of government, which means that the focus has been on expediency rather than on long-term planning and development goals. What we need, therefore, according to Lewis, is to fundamentally reform political parties and to simultaneously address the long-standing psychic injuries of structural racism and class prejudice. Weak civil and political will toward these ends is at the center of Anthony Harriot's assessment of Jamaica's crime problem. For Harriot, one of the commissioners for the West Kingston Commission of Inquiry and a well-known criminologist retired from the University of the West Indies, organized crime is, quote, at the center of gravity of the Jamaican crime problem. It corrupts, corrodes, and promotes a culture of silence. In his lecture, sponsored by the Grace Kennedy Foundation in Jamaica, Harriet argued that the state would have to reclaim a monopoly over the use of force by destabilizing networks that perpetuate organized crime, first through the seizure of resources, including financial contributions to political parties, and second, by mainstreaming urban impoverished communities through the creation of legal and viable opportunity structures. Combined with a program of police reform, correctional services modernization, social crime prevention, and the development of a legitimate opportunity structure and alternative forms of dispute resolution, Harriet argued, the Jamaican state might reassert itself in communities like Tivoli Gardens in transformative rather than punitive ways. And I think part of our discussion has been that, in fact, this can never be true. And many of these points are echoed in different ways by the Peace Management Initiative, in which Horace has been central, which is a civil society organization. I'm sure you're going to say much more about it. That was established in 2001 to work toward gang demobilization in really innovative ways, and toward the de-escalation of violence and developing sort of alternatives to youth, for youth, working with local dons. Dismantling the infrastructural scaffolding of garrison politics was, of course, also one of the main recommendations of the West Kingston Commission of Inquiry that was convened to investigate the conduct of the security forces in 2010. The commission also advocated for the provision of counseling services, the compensation of victims for property damage, wrongful death, injuries. They lobbied for the reform of the Jamaica Defense Force, which is the military, and the Jamaica Constabulary Force, which is the police.
By that time, no, I was feeling like...
No. All right, fine. And they also advocated for an apology, right, on the part of the government, within Parliament, to the people of West Kingston and Jamaica as a whole for the excesses of the security forces during that operation. External observers from ECLAC, which is you all know, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, were brought in. They assessed the socioeconomic effects of the events of May 2010, and they emphasized economic mainstreaming. They suggested conducting a benchmarking analysis, developing an economic cluster around things they saw as being proliferating economic activities within these communities: food, dry goods vending, music, sport, elaborating social welfare programs, establishing a microcredit facility for female-headed households, reducing stigma, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So all of these different organs are suggesting various kinds of recommendations for how to deal with garrison communities, and in particular, how to dismantle garrison communities and reintegrate garrison dwellers into mainstream Jamaican society. And some are emphasizing work from the ground up, others are suggesting reforms from the top down. But all of them are grounding concrete policy changes in the sort of practice of political economy. That this is a crucially important and extraordinarily difficult program goes without saying. However, what's not addressed explicitly in these recommendations is the broader kind of condition of our condition, right? The psychic and affective dimensions of the afterlives of colonial racism and the contemporary experience of the sedimented violence it has produced. Attention to this sphere is not usually plausible within government and juridical reports, and it really requires different kinds of archives to be able to recognize it, right? So I'm going to play you just a little bit now of another one of our interviewees, Annette Irving, whose sister was killed during the state of emergency. I'm going to tell you what she's saying, just because I'm worried you won't be able to understand her. You probably, you might. But so what she's talking about, she's talking about the general situation of what happened, and then she's reporting on having attended one of these counseling sessions that were organized for people in the community after the incursion. And she'll say that, during that session, she expressed her feeling that she was glad Keith Clark was murdered. So Keith Clark was an Upper St. Andrew accountant who was believed to have had ties with Dada's Coke. And so this is the uptown, the political, racial, and class divisions within Jamaica are measured spatially, as everybody else has been talking about. And the uptown-downtown divide is really the major one. So this is somebody who was a wealthy and a member of a well-known family, thought to have ties with Coke, and potentially thought to be hiding him, because when the security forces went into Tivoli Gardens, of course, they did not extract him. He wasn't there. So anyway, the police went into Keith Clark's house in the middle of the night on the 27th of May, shot him 21 times in front of his wife and children, 16 times in the back. And so what Annette is saying is that she's glad this happened to him too, because if it didn't happen outside Tivoli Gardens, no one would believe that this is something that the police do, right?
Well, I don't know.
And the sync is going to be off because
I don't know.
Coming through well.
I don't think them can compensate you for life. I think them can compensate you for damage to your property. Something I don't really know what to say. Because I don't know what them can do. For give you comfort, for ease you from what had happened. It was a massacre. Them have some nice pretty name like Encourage and for make it was a massacre. As I relate to someone, I went to a seminar and I said I am one of them glad about Keith Clark death, and yet I'm sorry because Keith Clark was a human being. But if it never happened outside of Tivoli Garden, nobody wouldn't believe. You sit down in your house and feel the building a shake. It's a bomb a drop. You think you're there in Iraq. The place a shake. I live on the ground floor. So imagine the people them up or them they feel. Most of the body them that was buried in that time period, in July, some of the box couldn't open. Because the body them were far state of decomposition. The state took disadvantage of the people them even after the people them relative pass.
All right, so I don't know if you got the last part, but she was saying that she was reflecting on the fact that during the incursion, bodies were left outside. People had to stay inside the house, and so the security forces had just left dead bodies outside, and it was hot and raining, and so many of these bodies decomposed significantly, so that people being called to identify their loved ones who had been killed, often it was difficult to recognize them. So attention to the kind of enduring processes Annette and Sean point us to is key to the to whatever real realignment of sovereignty and, importantly, repair that must happen. What I mean to argue is that we must formally recognize the following. Just as slavery was foundational to the development of modern capitalism in the New World, as well as to liberal notions of governance and private property and their imbrication within geographies of race and gender, the garrison is foundational to institutionalized political modernity in Jamaica. If racial slavery within the context of mercantile and later industrial capitalism is what transformed notions of personhood, value, and time reckoning in the Americas, then garrison politics is what has transformed the experience of citizenship in post-colonial Jamaica. If the European arrives at blackness under conditions of post-structuralism, and this is an argument that Kara Keeling makes, I can talk about it more later if you want to, then the national citizenry as a whole arrives at the garrison under pressures of neoliberalism. So the point that I'm trying to make is that the exceptionality of the garrison is actually constitutive of politics in Jamaica and of the relationship between politics and racial formations, not just in downtown Kingston, though residents might feel it there most keenly, but everywhere. We must therefore expose the transnational entanglements and geopolitical machinations that have facilitated the wealth, privileges, and protections that have made this kind of system possible over the years. And we must also confront and recognize the profound psychic legacies of these entanglements. Thanks.
Thank you. Horace, if you want to. I already introduced you.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad I wasn't here to hear it. Friends, good afternoon. Since I'm going to be talking about bloodshed and murder, you'll allow me also to bring you Bob Marley's Peace and Love and his brethren, the Rastafari, and maybe a bit of Usain Bolt as well. I want to start by thanking Michael and the Africana team for inviting me here, perhaps through her, for inviting me, hosting me and Jamaica very, very efficiently. I have to congratulate that team. Inviting Jamaica with its bare 2.8 million people to a conference involving Colombia, Canada, France, US, and Brazil with hundreds of millions of people. And hopefully, since Tugufu's point will be taken that it's the meaning of numbers that is more important than the numbers. Jamaica has much in common with a number of other countries in its harsh treatment by security forces to a significant number of its black population. This happens even though in Jamaica, 95%, by using the North American definition, are black. A ratio much higher in Jamaica than elsewhere outside, in Jamaica and other Caribbean islands, higher than elsewhere in the world outside of Africa. What accounts for this is a natural question. What is to be accounted for must be precisely pinned down. But given the population share, it is inevitable that most of the victims will be black. What will appear is that what is to be accounted for is the fact that the victims are blacks of a lower socioeconomic status, that the largest proportion of the killings are by gangs and other civilians, and that many of those by police have been done mano dura, extrajudicially. You will see that the Jamaican situation is complex. I'm going to begin with the quality of Jamaican violence, which is striking, and then along with it some effects, and follow that by tracking it back to its source or sources, and then tracing it forward to countering efforts, to outcome, and to future. The numbers. Suppose I should use this thing.
No, do you have no clicker?
Push, it says.
No, but that's your microphone. I don't know if there was a. Maybe somebody else can do it. For the slides. No, you may have.
Its current 52 per 100,000, less than the 62 to 63 of 2005 and 2009, but coming from the 1/3 decline that followed the incursion that Deborah has been talking about, it's worrying. The incursion in Tivoli Gardens. There's an upward trend that's real and it's worrying. Homicides up to the end of September this year, last month, was running 25% higher than last year. More than 1,350 it was last year. A rate of over 4 a day in a country 1/10 the size of Pennsylvania. Killings of police have so far been negligible. Killings by police are not negligible, but they're not included in the figure given. This year, after a 3-year dip to about half the previous 200 to 250 a year, they're climbing sharply this past year and should end up back around pretty close to 200 by the end of this year. Virtually all of them are outside of shoot-up confrontations. Thank you. Shootout confrontation, and over 40% are of victims who had no firearm. And that's data just released by the Independent Commission of Investigation, INDICOM. These figures do not include the classic case in recent history, which Deborah has been describing, the incursion in Tivoli Gardens, where in a day and a half, some 72 people died, and 45 to 50 of them, as one of her spokespersons said, were murdered in cold blood by soldiers and police. Murdered after the police had broken through the cordon and quelled the violence. There was no shooting back at police when they were murdered. And not only murdered, but covered up by elements of the security of the police force that were designated to locate the dead bodies and to keep records of them and so on. And the organization that was supposed to deal with that came in 10 days after the shooting had stopped. Right? So all the evidence was completely lost. There was a very good cover-up. Right? As a result, the Jamaican population didn't know what really transpired about the massacre. Those of us in civil society knew, but nobody was believing us. It wasn't until the Commission of Inquiry, which tabled its report last year, June, in the House of Parliament, that the public became aware of this. And up to 2 months ago, the police force were still trying to cover it up, refusing to accept the recommendations of the Commission of Inquiry. That was something that took place then. So what we have, the numbers are bad, they're epidemic bad. What is striking, however, is the kind of freeness that goes with it. People appear to be free to kill for the slightest thing, right? Disagreement between two brothers over how to cook dumplings. One man gets, one of them is killed by the other. And this is, of course, what's meant by an epidemic. It's easy to catch. It's catching. So killing is catching in Jamaica. It sounds bizarre, but that's the reality of the epidemic that grips the country. And the full horror of it still has not sunk home in the population. So the numbers are important in telling us how rapidly the disease is spreading. They don't tell us exactly its character. Our first analytic point on that is that the social epidemic is spread by example of others, right? And this example is portrayed in the newspapers, which print and photograph and the television as well, the most lurid examples. So that those who copy, of course, don't copy exactly. They want to improve on what they've copied. That's human nature, and that's what's going on. Copiers have options. And the homicidal climate encourages improvement. There's a climate. It's become a kind of independent, self-propelling, self-encouraging force. And it's not just an effect anymore. It's got its own dynamic. It's pushing. This may sound exaggerated, but consider for a moment how this epidemic over the past 15 years has found new expressions, ever worse forms. At first, for the sake of reprisal, it was directed only at the killer. You shot my brother, you killed my father, I'm going to kill yours. Then it moved to family members. We have a Jamaican maxim, you can't catch Quacko, you catch him shut, his shirt, somebody near to him. So it moved from killing the individual to killing any member of his family, or even any member of the community, right? So what that meant was the numbers increased from killing 1 to killing 2, 3, 4 on occasion, right? Outdoing the previous murders that you read about in the papers. From attacks, reprisals after dark, it moved to open killings in a plaza at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the killer walking calmly away, covered by the maxim that, you know, informer for dead, informers are to die, so nobody's going to inform on you, right? Or, as happens more often these days, drive-by shootings, which are indiscriminate, right? And then you've got the beheadings occasionally to give a message, send a message to your rivals. So the thing is brazen, right? The highest bar to date, right? I mean, brazen to the point of not beheadings, but also other things of that sort. The highest bar to date is killing the police. We're in the process of crossing that bar, right now, right? And that's very portentous for the future. So there's been a steady progression of old boundaries. The only rule now is that nothing is sacred. There's a growing callousness. And as younger teenagers catch the disease, it's particularly evident in them, right? Very threatening. So let me move to a few words about the effects. I won't say much on this because time will not allow me. But the effects, I should press this thing, shouldn't I? Where do I press? Anyway. Numbers, breakdown. Yeah, this is it. Thank you. What did I press? Oh, you press it for me. I've shifted up the sequence a little bit to be a little more logical. But the principal effects have been, first of all, on the economy. Only a couple of examples. The Inter-American Development Bank has put the loss to the economy at 3.7% of GDP. And this shows up in multiple ways, right? In the cost of businesses to have extra security, the cost of businesses because members of their workforce are delayed or absent because of murder in their communities. It shows up in hospitals, having to cope with gunshot and other conflict wounds, and postponing planned surgeries. 3 years ago, when the murder rate was a quarter lower than it is now, expenditure at state hospitals for victims of violence took 7% of health ministry budget, exceeding by 3 times the recommended spending on preventive measures. But the most difficult, and difficult to quantify, the most horrible effect is the impact of the trauma experienced by families and friends of those slain violently. University of the West Indies psychiatrist Fred Hicklin's estimate of mental disease in the population is high, but not to be dismissed. He puts the prevalence rate of psychosis in the society at nearly 5%, anxiety and depression at nearly 20%, and personality disorder at over 30%, which means that every second person in the society is suffering from trauma, right? 1 in 2. Almost 20 years ago, 1998, another psychiatrist, Wendell Abel, put the trauma rate, the psychosis rate, or the mental disorder rate at 5 to 10%. So it's escalated significantly. I mean, this has incalculable consequences on the health of the society, the performance, the productive performance of the society, and so on. Well, those are some of the effects. There are others I don't have time to go into. Let me go on, press a slide for me, to the, is that it? Or it should be really the numbers, the breakdown. Can you go back one slide? If I can find it now. What page are you here? Yeah, so I've indicated how high the numbers are. Oh, here it is back here, I think, yeah. And bear in mind that back in 1962, when Jamaica got its independence, the murder rate was for the year was 63. In other words, slightly over 1 a week. Now, as I've said, it's 4 a day. No, there's something missing here. Anyway, let me go on. I can't find the damn thing. I mean, yes, we've seen that already, example. We've seen that. No. I think what I was going to say about the breakdown is that approximately right now, I can remember it, 60 to 65% are ascribed to gangs of one sort or another. And there are different kinds, and it's a very important distinction. 15 to 20% are interpersonal. Another 15 to 20% are the result of domestic violence. But the gang violence is the one that has created the climate, right? The gangs have mutated, starting off as being linked politically to each of the two main political parties. We've got two, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, right? Fighting each other. That's changed, right? The gangs decided about 8 years ago they're no longer going to allow themselves to be shed blood for some political person, and they pulled back. But basically the structure was there, and so they continue to fight over turf, right? And so that's been, and these are community gangs, they are corner crews, they're not the criminal type of gang that the Shower Posse, the Dudas type was, the international gang was, right? Different type. Anyway, that's the breakdown of the political of the gangs and the murder rate. I want to go on to trace it back now to the political parties, because they're behind historically this violence, and it's important because you see, there's a general attribution of the violence to slavery, and that's undeniable. Right? Undeniable. But in between slavery and colonialism on the one hand and the present situation, something else occurred. And that something else is the political parties. Right? Two political parties in Jamaica emerged in 1938 to 1944. Right? The Jamaica Labour Party, in spite of the name, representative of the capitalist element, and the People's National Party, which even then was professing itself to be socialist, a kind of socialism more akin to what you have in Scandinavian countries. Certainly not the Marxist variety, but it got labeled that by the opposition Labour Party, and so it lost the first two elections. It had to attenuate its socialism in order to get elected in 1953. Now, the thing about those parties is that, and this has been traced by Amanda Sives in Elections, Violence, and the Democratic Process in Jamaica, 1944 to 2007. Two parties emerged, and they captured in the process the revolt that the black working class had carried out in 1938. They captured it, and these two parties are led by the brown middle class, articulate and so on, and able to do that. And they have kept alternating control of the state. Now, I prefer to talk about the parties rather than the state. More concrete, right? More realistic, right? They alternate in their control of the state. They're very different initially, but when Michael Manley, son of the first Manley, came back to power in 1989, he shifted away from the socialism he was professing in the 70s and went back to liberal capitalism in the 90s. So he moved in the direction of the Labour Party. And over the last 5 years or so, especially over the last couple of years, the Labour Party has moved in the direction of what the PNP was, right? talking about housing and so on, which was always a PNP domain, right? And that's a deliberate choice. Now, what had happened was that these two parties established what Deborah was talking about, garrisons across the inner city, right? A large section of Jamaica's inner city was garrisoned in that way. And garrisons meant physical harm to your opponents. If this was a PNP community, JLP could not venture in there without suffering physically. You're in danger of your life and your property by doing that. So you're kept out, obviously. And the same worked the other way for the other party, and so on. So from the beginning, youth gangs were set up, were financed by the parties to defend these garrisons, right? So the garrisons became the matrix of the formation of these youth gangs. So they're fighting each other, not against the parties. The parties are financing them. The parties are offering them goodies, right? Guns and contracts and so on. So they're fighting each other. And that's carried on, right? And at the same time, unemployment and poverty remains in the inner city, right? It stays put in spite of a certain exercise of social power. The unemployed and the lumpen were able to exploit their position, extract from the predatory parties some measure of relief, as Obika Gray's demeaned but empowered has brilliantly exposed. Now, the political parties have mainly pulled back from this liaison with these gangs, right, over the last few years. Right? You know, the Frankenstein that they created, they now want to distance themselves from it, but they don't quite know how. And this is because their commitment to real change is deeply suspect. They don't know how to control this monster because they're robbed of vision by the scotoma, right? The blind spot created by their own decades of direct role in the violence and its structural source. And they've been robbed of caring by their class position and by their preoccupation with achieving power, political power. They were referred to that election machinery thing, which certainly developed very strongly in the 1990s, because Siago was hanging on to power, and his rival in the PNP was able to capitalize on that and keep the PNP in power for 17 straight years. Whereas previously they alternated every 10 years, now for once the PNP were in power for some 17 years. But what the parties have done is to become the maintenance crew for the structure that came down from slavery and colonialism. This structure is a hierarchy, which the whites are on top, the browns are in the middle, and the blacks at the bottom of the heap. Right? And they've done this from the time independence was declared in 1962. Right? And I mean, that independence was more conferred on Jamaica. It wasn't fought for. Right? And that tells you a lot. And the motto itself tells you, out of many one people. The same as here in the States, a pluribus unum, no? But a different meaning. What it meant in Jamaica, what it means in Jamaica, is that the blacks are marginalized in effect in favor of the white minority. The black majority is downplayed. It's not a black country as far as this motto is concerned. It's a multicultural country, which is just nonsense. Right? So it's a raced class structure in effect. And it operates in much more penetrative ways than even just talking about the hierarchy suggests. Right? I mean, it penetrates the social, the psychological, the economic spheres. Fanon has excellently analyzed the phenomenon of internalization of the oppressor's perspective by the oppressed. Right? The police force is an example of the retained hierarchy. To make the hierarchy secure after a rebellion in 1865, the colonial master established a constabulary force modeled on the paramilitary force in Northern Ireland, not on London constabulary, but on the paramilitary in Northern Ireland. Right? Northern Ireland was effectively a colony then, in those days. A century later, and only 6 years after independence, a Prime Minister, Hugh Shearer, was advising the police, read no beatitudes, take no measurements. In other words, shoot first. ask questions after, right? And a few years later, Michael Manley, Prime Minister from 1972, was setting up a gun court painted red, right? And establishing a law, suppression of forget the name of it, suppression of crimes legislation, which had to be repealed 19 years later as contrary to the Constitution, right? So, you know, that's the sequence, you know, coming down an established structure which is there in place. It plays out most directly on the economic front because the whites control the main economic levels. It's not to say there are a few blacks up there, you know, but it's mainly the Lebanese, who are called Syrians, and others of that dimension, of that color. Their influence is exercised, of course, quietly, but the politicians who are black are unable to resist it, essentially. They can't afford to for long. So essentially, the politics has failed to move the economy forward. Not even Manley's attempt at socialism in the 70s, right? Manley did brilliantly in opening up the country in the social dimension, right? As somebody put it then, your black servant could walk in through the front door for the first time rather than having to go around the back door, right? But on the economic front, Manley did not succeed. But the important thing about Manley, which must be remembered, especially in the context of remarks I made yesterday about the white capitalists up there, is that Manley was challenging this little island, you know, crazy on the margin. Manley was challenging the imperial power by attempting to get control of the bauxite that Jamaica was mining. At the time, Jamaica's bauxite was important internationally. And Jamaica attempted to set up a relationship with the mining people in Mexico and so on. Of course, he was shut up. He was destroyed, in effect. He couldn't. It was a daring thing. And I mean, what the Americans did, the US, was to classify his socialist attempt as communism. He traveled in Fidel's plane. He was a friend of Fidel. But I mean, Michael was the furthest you could possibly get from being a communist or anything close to communism. And I know that personally from my experience when I was trying to organize in a vain and very naive attempt, sugar workers, into worker-controlled cooperatives. And Manley was then the prime minister and confronted me, and of course was trying his thing, and we were saying nothing doing. You know, we're not into your stuff. So what's happened since then is that essentially Jamaica's debt accumulated, you know, up to 147% of GDP. It's come down now as a result of going back to the IMF after we left the IMF. It's down to 120%, and hopefully still sinking. And we're still sticking, even though that was a year ago that happened. We've entered a new precautionary standby arrangement, so that we're still on IMF terms. But the growth last year was 1.3%, and this year it actually slipped back into negative. Employment is enormous. 21% of the population is below the poverty line, and the government doesn't have the money, the cash, to either intervene in a productive way or to deal with social problems. And it's this urge for economic quality of some sort, economic equality, which is driving the force of the gangs and the violence, right? I mean, the gang thing, it's important to this, you know. I mean, the lowest level, there are 3 levels according to the police. The top level is the nudist type, international, a serious criminal gang. The middle level is a criminal gang, but local. And the bottom level is what we, in the Peace Management Initiative, I talk about that a little later, call the defense crew, from research we have done, because they see themselves as defending their community against a rival community. They will lean on the corner drugstore, the corner grocery, for a pound of flour or a pound of sugar, right? That's not what the scammers are doing and what the middle level gangs are doing, which are not very numerous. They are targeting retired American citizens and sucking their retirement money out of them by means of telephone and internet and so on. And the byproduct of that, because they're earning millions of US dollars a year, right, is more violence because the other criminals are targeting the money that the scammers are reaping. So, one quality of that scene is huge inequality. And inequality, sociologists have demonstrated very clearly over the years, is a leading source of violence. Jamaica rates inequality is very high in this hemisphere, and Jamaica rates as perhaps one of the highest in that regard, right? The worst rates. One of my favorite authorities on inequality is Harvard psychiatrist James Gilligan in his Preventing Violence. In my mind, it's brilliant. He connects the economic side of inequality, to its psychological impact on disrespect, on contempt, on disdain, on shaming, on humiliating. And this is the background of slavery and colonialism. And Jamaicans react very much to disrespect. Respect is a frequent term of greeting and of farewell, respect. So I come finally. How much time have I got?
You should try to wrap it up.
I should try to wrap
Yeah.
up? Lord.
But you seem to be at the conclusion now.
Okay, yeah, I'm coming to the conclusion. Well, what I'm coming to is the countering effects, and that's near to the end, I assure you. Yes, I'm coming to PMI. Countering efforts. Well, there's community policing. The state tried that from the late 1990s, early 2000s. Thousands of police have been trained in it, but there's a tradition of paramilitary policing and indisciplined or undisciplined policing, which completely undermines the community policing. What's happened a year ago, sorry, not a year ago, 2 months ago, is that the state has come with another thing called Zones of Special Operation, ZOSOs for short, the acronym. It's another name for a localized zone of emergency. And they have set that up in a community at the other end of the island where a lot of the violence is taking place, but they selected a community where the violence was very low. What they've done one very positive thing, very, very positive, right? The police and the military who are in there are respecting human rights. So they've turned around, they've turned away from the hard policing that's been traditional. That's extremely positive on the one hand, right? On the other hand, the promise of social intervention, right, is very weak. It's almost non-existent. They're not doing the one thing they need to do, which is to target the mainstreaming of the youth in there. And they're not doing anything about building community spirit. If those two things were done, the criminals would have no space to operate. They're not doing that. 2 days ago, on Tuesday, 3 days ago, they established the second ZOZO. I don't know what's happening there. I left the next morning very early, so I haven't found out this yet. But there's failure there, right? So we're not very optimistic about it. I mean, the rate of killings has not come down as a result of the first ZOZO. I'm not expecting it to come down because of the second, but I'm waiting to see. I'm waiting to see. But there's something else that's gone on. Two other things. One is that the state established late in October 2010 an independent commission of investigation. This was partly the result of an independent CSO, Jamaicans for Justice, of which I have been for the last year and a half the executive director. But this was done then. And that commission has, by prosecuting police for their killings, has caused a reduction right, that I spoke about earlier, right? From 200 and 250, it came down last year to about 111. It's gone back up this year for reasons which are not very clear at all, but it's gone back up, right? The prosecutor, of course, it had tremendous resistance from the police. Police took them to court. The police has stalled them in many, many ways. But that's a positive, and its future is hopeful. The other positive is the Peace Management Initiative, established in 2002 by the then Minister of National Security. Actually, it is a joint effort between the state and civil society. It is established as an independent company, an independent NGO, but it receives much of its funding from the state. It acts independently. It's not directed by the state. What it does is it tries to it mainstreams the youth in the communities, the ones who are in these defense crews, right, who are not essentially criminal-minded. They are youth who have taken up the gun to defend the community and to defend their turf and so on. And it mainstreams, and it's been very effective now in 4 parishes, right, 4 parishes, including one where the remnants of garrisons still exist, because garrisons took a death blow from the incursion into Tivoli. That was one of the positive effects of the incursion into Tivoli. Incursion into Tivoli was a massacre, yes, but it also was the assertion of the central authority of the state, which was really needed. It's the weakness in the state which has encouraged a lot of the violence. Between the two parties, the state has remained weak. Right? The central authority has not exercised itself. Right? And that was what happened in the incursion. For the first time in decades, it exercised that authority and had a positive effect. Right? And that's still needed. Right? So we are left with this hierarchical structure. And paradoxically, what goes on is that you still have black against black. Right? Strangely enough, you know, it's, two contrary things are happening. There was a poll just around Independence Day a couple months ago in which 49% of the population expressed themselves in favor of Jamaica remaining as a colony. Imagine that. I mean, that was just dismaying the conscious people in Jamaica. And it's even worse when you take the other figure, that 27% said they didn't know. So only 24% were voting in favor of Jamaica being independent. Paradoxically, on the other hand, Jamaicans don't feel inferior to anybody. They're an aggressive set, right? Internationally as well, with a bad sense in that too, right? But they don't go in for they're going for spontaneous demonstrations, but not for organized. Jamaicans tend to go around things rather than to confront it. And one of the go-arounds is the resistance through conflict, through murder. And that's going on. So what's the future like? I go back to something I said or should have said earlier. Political parties profess to want to control the Frankenstein they themselves fashioned, but they don't know how. Their commitment to real change is suspect. Robbed as they are of vision by the scotoma they created decades-long road in the violence and the structural source, and they're emptied of all caring by preoccupation with power and class position. They can offer only petty incremental change, not the needed radical police reform and community development. And behind them lurks the white supremacy that we talked about earlier. Thank you very much.